Hello, my friends. Let's talk about the God's thumbprint argument. God's thumbprint is the argument that if God exists, we would see the impact of God acting upon the world. This often translates into looking for miracles or instances of things that cannot possibly happen. Isn't this weird that only the impossible could be the evidence for God? The people who invoke this argument want empirical evidence for biblical-style miracles, and they want the empirical evidence for something that is not empirically possible. Firstly, I find this weird because the argument seems to purposefully counter notions of Christian fundamentalism, which is a recent movement specifically developed in the United States that interprets the Bible as being literal, historical, and empirical. The vast majority of religious people are not fundamentalists today. Christians before this movement did not take the Bible in a literal sense. So who is this argument meant to convince? Fundamentalists who won't listen, or non-fundamentalists who never denied empiricism in the first place, but still find value in faith? Or is the argument for people who don't have a faith in God, but want to invoke empiricism as a counterproof? Well, I honestly think the argument is for no one. Regardless of this argument being convincing to no one except people who already agree with the conclusion, let's look at the actual burdens of the argument that would meet the standard. So my second point, the God's thumb argument, is essentially a statement on the part of the person who does not hold a belief in God of, if you simply show me this, I will then believe in God. But if you don't, I will not. Now, in debate, when you establish a burden, the burden should actually be achievable, and it is the duty of the orator to show that the burden has or has not been met. Now, if it is impossible to meet the burden at the conception of the burden itself, then the standard that has been established is itself unrealistic and hostile. So let's evaluate why God's thumbprint is an unrealistic and self-contradictory standard. We've already discussed how the very idea of looking for empirical evidence of something that is empirically impossible as a burden is self-contradictory, and to be presented by people who believe, for the most part, that God is not going to be empirically contradictory to what actually exists is also ridiculous. For a conception of God that does not require God to be separate from our known reality, I suggest reading the works of Benedict de Spinoza, and more specifically his Tractatus Theologica Politicus. But let's look at scientific experimentation and how that operates for a moment. When you conduct an experiment to collect empirical evidence, and you release a paper describing the whole process, what happens? Others take your findings and try to reproduce that empirical evidence before it is accepted. Reproducibility is one of the founding tenets of the scientific community. But the God's thumbprint argument says, I want you to show me something impossible and unexplainable, a miracle, so that I have empirical evidence of something non-empirical. For the sake of argument, let's say that someone is able to do just that, to show a one-of-a-kind miracle. Then what's the next step? The empiricist says, okay, now explain that miracle to me such that I can empirically reproduce the miracle and confirm that it is true. Well, that, by the definition of what has been asked for, cannot be done. And if it could be done, if it could be empirically described and demonstrated to be reproducible, it would thus fail the first test of being a non-empirically possible occurrence. The God's thumbprint argument inherently includes a moving the goalpost fallacy so that it can never be convinced. For my third point, let's assume again, for the sake of argument, that someone met that first premise of demonstrating a miracle, and the empiricist didn't move the goalpost into the self-contradictory standard of reproducibility. What then would the scientific community do? Well, what does the scientific community normally do when an observation conflicted with their current models for reality? They change the model, or expand it, or they develop an entirely new model to explain the phenomenon. If you take a look at the history of the Earth-centric models of the solar system, you see how absurd men of great intellect at the time were willing to make the Earth-centric model before eventually accepting the heliocentric model. For more contemporary examples, take the recent history of the hostility toward quantum mechanics and Einstein's famous "God does not play dice" quote. And of course, the current fights being had over any incarnation of string theory that tries to bridge the gap between our two dominant models. If something comes up that doesn't match, the empiricist will find a way to make it match, or create an entirely isolated rule set to explain it. Sometimes, smart people are more quick to throw out the baby than they are the bathwater. And that isn't a problem with science, scientists, or the scientific community's standards. That is a problem of humanity's own inherent behavioral faults and prejudices. For my final point, I want to recognize that not only, as I have already shown, that the God's thumbprint argument is a false standard for being dishonest and fallacious as a burden of proof, but that it is actually just not effective towards its goal. That it wouldn't actually act as a disproof of the existence of a God-like entity, because ultimately, it is only effective at disproving a single and highly specific conception of God that the vast majority of theists do not ascribe to. I've already alluded to this at the start. For one, the God's thumbprint assumes a version of God that operates outside of physical law, a God that can deny reality itself. This doesn't need to be the case. God can just be that which makes the physical laws to be what they are, rather than anything inconsistent with nature as we know it. Second, it assumes that a God that could deny physical law would ever actually deny those laws, and would do so at request if the God could. This is a kind of God that most theists do not believe in. It may be in much closer agreement with the trends of Christianity in the United States, but literal Bible fundamentalism was an invention of the United States. So that should be expected. But what does this God's thumbprint argument do to deny the Hindu conception of Brahman, or the Shinto pantheism, where literally everything is in some way a god? If you are attempting to present an argument for why any conception of the divine is false, you will need a more significant and robust argument. Something better than the verbal equivalent of sticking your face in the sand and yelling, "I didn't see anything." Now, I'm not saying you have to believe in God. I'm not disparaging anyone who wants proof or good reason for their beliefs. I am disparaging a hermeneutical standard that mandates pure empiricism, because that inherently misunderstands the operation of the human mind, the role of rationality in directing thought, and arbitrarily dismisses abstract mathematics without realizing that it does. But above all, I'm just criticizing the use of an extremely poor argument for denying the existence of God, when there are far better arguments for denying God's existence than this one. If you're going to fight the good fight, at least come out punching. Don't be half-assed about it. Thank you for listening, everyone. Here's the part where I remind that the PhilosIffy segment of my channel is just a space for me to get out my half-baked ideas, and doesn't necessarily represent what I take to be my full and complete beliefs, no matter how emotionally I deliver them. If you enjoyed this episode, by all means, please subscribe to the channel and share it around with your friends. I don't pay anyone to advertise the channel for me, so the only way that we can grow is with your help. Take everything I say with a grain of salt, and I hope to see you next week for a philosophical analysis of some video game or anime series. And, as always, stay true.